Welcome everyone to this webinar. The webinar is organized by the Center for Autism and Theology. My name is Leon van Ommen. I am one of the center's co-directors. And before I introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Karenne Hills, let me briefly introduce the center to you. The Center for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 by my colleague Grant McCaskill and several other colleagues in the Department of Divinity at the University of Aberdeen. The Centre aims to host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, church, and faith. And as such, we hope that the Centre can function as a hub that brings together all those interested in this intersection of autism and theology. And in this way, we hope to contribute to the academic world, but also to be of service to the church and other faith communities. As part of our activities, we organize 2 webinars each teaching term. So that's 4 per year. Do take a look at our website to see more details and how you might get involved with the center if you want. And of course, you can follow us on social media as well. Links will be later in the slides in the webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Karenne Hills. Karenne completed her Ph.D. titled Spirituality in the Context of Nonverbal Autism in 2019. She operates a private practice combining her professional qualifications in areas of counseling, nursing, teaching, disability, and autism. She also consults to local disability organizations and Local Means for Her Australia, and is currently working on an innovative program designed to support students with specialized learning abilities to achieve success in post-school educational and employment opportunities. Karenne speaks regularly at local, national and international conferences on a variety of topics pertaining to people with disabilities, spirituality and autism. Karenne has published in several academic journals and books. I must say that I'm particularly excited to introduce Karenne today because she is one of the very, very few scholars who have done significant research into the spiritual lives of non or minimally speaking autistic people. And at our Center for Autism and Theology, we are keen to develop more research with this vastly underserved and under-researched group of people. And so, Karenne, it's a real pleasure to welcome you as our guest speaker today. Now, before I give the floor to Karenne, just a few practical notes. Karenne will talk for about 40 minutes. After that, we will have a 2-minute break. During the break and after, you can type your questions in the chat box, and then we will have a time of questions and answers. Without further ado, Karenne, Dr. Hills, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and I did want to start off with saying good morning, but for me it's actually 8 p.m. in the evening in Brisbane, Australia. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share with you some of the aspects of my research alongside a very vibrant and talented group of people. My discussion today follows 3 phases of a journey that involved much more physical, emotional and spiritual energy than the finished thesis gives credit for. As with many research studies, the ideas for my studies came from my own life experiences and therefore provide a background to the conceptualization of the research. Secondly, the research itself brought answers to my questions, however, also gave birth to many more questions. The journey is not yet over. The final phase of today's presentation looks to future opportunities for research and inclusion. Before I begin, I would just like to make a quick disclaimer about my research, which I formally started in 2013, however, had been pursuing for some years before this. The world was a very different place then, and the common term for people with severe autism was nonverbal autism. My literature review was published in 2016 using this term to describe the review and became the title of the thesis. Since then, the terms of reference have become more inclusive, and where possible, I will use the more appropriate terms. However, in some instances, I may need to refer to the research using the terminology that was appropriate when I actually wrote it. So, when undertaking qualitative research into any group of people, one of the first things the researcher might do is search for similarities or common traits that a certain group of people, whoever they represent, might hold. So when researching people with autism, this same thing happens, and the researcher finds themselves looking for the similarities that make people with autism stand apart from the rest of society. However, Stephen Mark Shaw said, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Each individual is unique, and unfortunately, it is the relational and societal difficulties that people with autism appear to exhibit that researchers predominantly study with an overall view to correcting these difficulties. My research came from a different perspective, and in this presentation, I will more or less tell the story of how my research into the spirituality of minimally or nonverbal autistic people formulated and arrived at the place that it is today. There's no argument that the incidence of autism continues to increase, with statistics growing annually. Consequently, there is a growing body of research concerning various considerations for autistic people. However, a paucity of information pertaining to those placed on the severe end of the spectrum. Communication and social issues typical of a diagnosis of severe autism have presented apparent barriers to first-hand research with this group. However, with the wider acceptance of augmented communication, this reason for such gaps is no longer valid. Since the completion of my thesis in 2019, a few other studies have focused on this group, but mostly in regards to improving speech. My study was designed to specifically explore the lived experience of people with nonverbal autism, as it was then referred. As spirituality is recognised as providing a path for the exploration and meaning of the human experience, the study explored the spirituality of people with severe autism who, by their life context, are often excluded from typical religious teaching and tradition. So this research was birthed from my own life journey with my two sons, both of whom have significant disabilities. It is within the context of my grappling with some difficult existential considerations concerning my children that some unanswered questions arose that led to this study. During my first long-awaited pregnancy, I experienced a type of spiritual encounter that assured me of a divine purpose in my circumstances. My baby had been diagnosed with a condition considered incompatible with life outside the womb, and all medical advice offered no hope for a positive outcome to the pregnancy. As one tends to do in a life crisis such as this, I sought meaning and comfort through prayer and meditation. Sometime during that pregnancy, I had a type of epiphany, and I remained convinced that I was given 3 promises directly from God. These 3 promises were that I was having a boy, I didn't know that at that stage, that he would live, and that I was to name him Samuel, which means God heard my prayer. And he did live. He is now 35, and that is him on the right of the picture. Yet all medical advice and contemporary social thought to such a situation during my pregnancy proved inaccurate against the conviction I held, which I still believe was divinely inspired. As Sam grew, however, it became increasingly clear that he wasn't meeting his milestones like his peers, and eventually I needed to face that he had some type of disability. This possibility never entered my head during the pregnancy. At that time, I was only concerned with his viability. Sam lives with a mild physical and moderate intellectual disability. 6 years later, I found myself pregnant with my other son, Mitchell, when, to my dismay, a routine scan discovered cysts on his choroid plexus, which is a part of the brain. I was told that on that day that these cysts were an indication of Down syndrome, so again I had a long and frightening pregnancy. It turned out, however, that once more the medical profession was in error. Mitchell did not have Down syndrome, but was born with hydrocephalus, which is fluid on the brain. As he grew, it became clear that he was also well placed on the autism spectrum. I spent a lot of years struggling to reconcile our family's journey, especially in light of the spiritual encounter I had experienced during my pregnancy with Sam. One day when Sam was about 10, another awareness hit me like a brick from heaven, And that was that the promise I received about Sam was never about disability. It was about whether he would live, and he did. As I came to understand that God knew and named my baby in the womb, I began to see his disability in a whole new way. Okay, I'll go back and show you the picture of my boys. There they are. This one on the right here is Sam, and that's Mitch. So over time, I became aware that despite my children's disabilities, they seem to both have spiritual insights beyond what would be considered typical for children their age. There were many, many times that they amazed me with stories and insights that were beyond my experience and understanding. I began to see that my children and other people I knew with certain disabilities seemed to have a type of giftedness unique to them. This led me to ponder their life experience in the context of a divine being, which created a conflict within me because of the attitudes of people around me to people with disabilities. Society often conceptualizes someone with a disability as a tragic mistake. I became aware that difference does not mean less than, which has been the dominant social understanding. I also became convinced that my children, and indeed all people, were crafted to the same intentional God-inspired design. So how did all this come together? I needed to expand my mind. I had so many questions. Now, if you need to expand your mind, then a PhD thesis will certainly help you along that path. My ponderings led me to query how someone might experience and/or express their spirituality if they were not able to access traditional religious teaching or involvement. Would or could such a spiritual pursuit lead to a divine human encounter? If so, would that encounter be unique to the life circumstance of that human? What is this experience, and does the inability to express such an experience negate its existence? If people with profound disabilities have a unique spirituality, can the experience alone lead towards deeper divine connection? What more is there to learn? I had all these questions. So these experiences, along with my journey with my sons, encouraged me to explore spirituality in relation to people with disabilities further. It would be many years of seeking. However, life brought me opportunity to ponder all these questions and many more. As I sought God over many years theologically, I also had a number of quite profound spiritual experiences that informed my thinking and growing awareness of the God-inspired design of people with disabilities. One such of those experiences was with a young man named Andrew. So I met Andrew on a camp at the time that was called for severe and profoundly disabled people. All participants on the camp were non-verbal, and when we went to pick up Andrew from his home, he became very distressed at leaving his family and going into a car with a group of unknown people away, and it was actually respite for his family. And he became very, very distressed over the next few hours while we were travelling. So I was starting to formulate my ideas about people with disabilities, and I had no idea what I was doing. This was just something that I thought in my mind might be supportive of him in the situation that he was in at the time. And so I approached Andrew quietly by myself, away from everybody else, and took off my glasses, looked at him very intensely, and told him that everything would be okay, just to calm down, and that Jesus loved him. I didn't know what else to say. What happened next really astounded me. He turned around and went into his bedroom and lay on his bed for 2 hours. He didn't move, he didn't sleep. He had his eyes opened, and we kept checking on him. He just laid there quietly. After 2 hours, he got up, and he was a completely transformed young man. He was engaging, he was calm, he was happy, he was very attached to me for that weekend, and we had an amazing weekend of learning to communicate. So he was the first person who was non-speaking that taught me to communicate with my eyebrows, actually. So I don't know what happened to him in that 2 hours, but I'm convinced that something happened, that he had some kind of spiritual experience, and it completely changed him in that moment, or in those couple of hours. So all these thinking and pondering and experiences led me to begin the PhD. And this, of course, was all explored through the context of minimally or non-speaking autistic people. I don't think you'll need much background information about autism, but in a nutshell, we know that it is a spectrum disorder over a huge range of expressions. For those on the severe end of the spectrum, life can present many challenges, not the least being the inability to communicate with speech. People with severe autism are also noted to be extremely sensitive to noise, to atmospheric changes, and to their environment. This led me also to ponder the likelihood that this acute sensitivity would also impact their spiritual awareness. Because the world literally revolves around language, societal attitudes and norms have created the worldview that assumes that no language equates to no intelligence. As such, people with severe autism are a severely under-researched and therefore misunderstood group. Almost all research pertaining to people with non-verbal autism prior to my thesis had focused on innovations designed to support verbal speech. There is no conclusive findings on why some autistic people are minimally or non-verbal, but approximately 40% of diagnoses of autism are represented in this group. Slowly, however, we are seeing developments with the introduction and wider acceptance of assisted communication. Not without its opposition and challenges, the invention of various methods of assisted or facilitated communication has finally given non-speaking people a voice. After pursuing knowledge about autism, the next step for me was to make a theological response to what I was discovering. As we know, theology is the study of religious faith, practice, and experience, the study of God and God's relation to the world. It is the discipline that supports the knowledge and understanding of God and how humans relate to this being. My own faith journey in the context of my children's disabilities made this theological response extremely important for me to pursue. Pardon. Disability theology is a growing empirical discipline within the field of theology that our friend John Swinton describes as a different way of looking at God and humanness. As with many different expressions of humanness, there is opportunity within the discipline of disability theology for sound theological pursuit to a better understanding of autistic people. With initiatives like this is a beginning to become a reality that I only dreamed of throughout my thesis. The other focus of my research was the area of spirituality, which speaks to subjective human concepts such as connectedness to a higher being or God, to other people, and to nature. Spirituality is concerned with the search for life's meaning and purpose, and is also known to encompass experiences of transcendence and otherworldly encounters, such as the one I experienced during my first pregnancy. The understanding and definition of spirituality continues to be debated amongst scholars. Spirituality has been described as primarily about lived experience, a place that is orientated towards discovery, where humanity meets the divine. Therefore, to me, spirituality is a very experiential encounter with God. I've come to understand that spirituality and theology are intimately related. They inform and validate each other. Our scriptures are full of stories about people who met God in an experiential encounter, which demonstrates that spirituality and theology are intimately related. So my research argued that the subjective and individual nature of spirituality defies the need to provide concrete understandings of such experiences, with definitions being determined by the perspective of the individual. Spirituality is recognised as a mysterious and subjective element to the human experience. Likewise, autism is representative of a relatively new human consideration, with much yet to discover about the condition and those people it touches. Undertaking a research study that combined two relatively mysterious entities suggested an uncharted path of discovery. The study sought to explore the spirituality of people who cannot typically express a belief or understanding of traditional religious doctrine. This exploration involved creating a multidisciplinary approach to working with people who do not use oral speech to communicate. An initial research question, do people with nonverbal autism hold a spirituality that is not traditionally informed, guided the first stage of the study. My research aims were to come from a place of genuine inquiry and to be invited into the world of the person before me, rather than to invite them into my world, assuming it to be better or somewhere where they'd really like to be. They might have been happy where they were. So that was where we came from. So you can't really pursue a research study concerning any aspect of disability without reference to the different models of disability. Historically, religious attitudes to disability have not been helpful, and the spiritual or religious needs of persons with a disability have not been particularly embraced by either the medical or social models. As such, little is known about the spiritual needs or experiences of people with certain conditions, such as severe autism. However, it has also been argued that spirituality provides purpose and meaning to the life of someone living with a disability. It should not be presumed that the life or experience of another be considered within the same perspective as someone else might perceive it to be. So in other words, all spiritual experiences are personal and individual and cannot be categorised according to the perception of others. Nor should the absence of traditional expressions of spirituality facilitate doubt as to the existence of its presence. Ultimately, it could be proposed that for any person seeking personal discovery and self-awareness, the path becomes a spiritual journey. It is a journey unlike one undertaken by any other person. This journey becomes a unique spiritual discovery within the context of a person's individual life circumstances. This understanding is no less relevant for people with disabilities, and it was a fundamental backdrop to my research questions. As I conducted the research and became entrenched in the literature, I began to notice a divide in what I was learning about the current social attitudes to many people with a disability and what I was learning through my studies, along with my involvement in the disability theology community. However, within the contemporary religious studies at the time, the discourse regarding people with autism presupposed the absent self theory, which was used to justify their exclusion from many religious traditions. The common belief that people with autism lack a sense of self, the ability to feel empathy or connect with others on a relational level has, at least in part, informed this concept. Therefore, striving to understand the autistic experience from any of the current religious or philosophical perspectives was detrimental to the goals of the research, as these perspectives have silenced the lived theologies or spirituality of people with autism. It was imperative for me that the exploration of spiritual matters for people living with autism must come from information sourced from within the group. As traditional religious sources appear to lack understanding or acceptance of atypical faith, people who present with different perspectives are often excluded. Arguably, exploring the spirituality of people with autism from a second-hand perspective would have been damaging to understanding the complexity and diversity within the community of believers, and would likely serve to further silence and devalue the voices of an already marginalised group. Therefore, I was challenged to embark on this research solely from the perspectives of the intended participants, which of course were minimally or non-speaking autistic people. As such, language needed to become a consideration. In a traditional sense, spirituality can be seen to adopt a language of its own to support transcendent and fluid concepts. The use of metaphor to conceptualize spiritual matters is not new and can be seen as a way to merge mysterious and abstract concepts with the confines of human experience. It has been identified that metaphoric representation can inform non-traditional spiritual approaches that provide deeper meaning to subjective experiences. Similarly, types of communication such as rhythm, for example, drumbeat, touch, and intuition have typically been used to experience and express spirituality. Symbolism is another important expression of spirituality, as this type of conceptualization can expand an experience beyond a socially constructed reality. The relevance of such expressions to people who live within a life context that excludes them from typical religious involvement is significant as the construction of a personal spirituality by use of metaphor or symbolism relevant to an individual life becomes credible. This also became an important backdrop to the study. So to start off with, I started with a literature review. There were 5 phases to the literature search. However, phases 4 and 5 were introduced after completing phases 1, 2, and 3. What became evident when we looked at phases 1, 2, and 3, that theology of disability, theology and spirituality of disability, all through the lens of autism, particularly as it was called then non-verbal autism, that there was barely, almost none, no literature, hardly anything, and absolutely nothing on non-speaking people. So the research gaps, and I won't go through them, I'll just whiz over them, but there was lots of research gaps that there was little information regarding the role of spirituality. Few studies investigated religious views or understandings of people with any type of intellectual or developmental disability. I think there was just Jill Harshaw at the time who did something on intellectual disability, but not relevant to autism specifically. There was no research on spirituality of people with non-verbal autism from their own perspectives or from any perspective, really. Phase 3 also had little gaps everywhere and few studies. So we moved on to stage 4 and 5 when we had no literature. We had nothing to work with. And phases 4 and 5, we had to look further afield to the grey literature. And so there was some online books, online blogs, some Facebook sites, and there was a collection of books, about a dozen at the time, of autobiographies that were either authored or co-authored by somebody with non-verbal autism at the time. And these were the only sources of information that was available. And so I included them in the literature for my literature review, and I gave them a little title according to what the language was at the time, and I called them the non-verbal narrative works, and because they honoured the group that they represented. And these were vital to the research because there was no academic literature on the topic. And in 2014, not long after I started my research, forgive me if I say this wrong, Louis and colleagues, I think working with, anyway, they did a study on autism, but they worked basically with people with Asperger's syndrome. But in their study, they noted that creative approaches are needed to discern the perspectives and practices of individuals who cannot speak but still have something important to say about this area in their lives, and that became foundational to me as well. As I delved into the literature, I quickly noticed that spirituality was inevitably mentioned as a significant in the life of the author, irrespective of any religious involvement. So that was a common theme in the books. And I also noted a global concern for spirituality and the spiritual development of others in this little collection of books about people with non-speaking autism. So furthermore, exceptional transcendent experiences also seem to be a common theme in this literature. And the interesting thing about these books was that they were really random from around the world. There was one from Japan, and one from Germany, and one or two from America, and then a few from England, one or two from Australia. And so these were people that didn't know each other, and they were all reporting similar things about spirituality. Mostly they told their own story, but spirituality became really important in that literature. So another discovery from the literature review was the wide use of facilitated communication within the nonverbal narrative literature. So by now I had attended a workshop here in Brisbane for a group of non-speaking poets called the Brotherhood of the Wordless to source participants for the study. And this is a picture of the whole group. Not all of these people were participants of the study, but everyone here was in the study, but I won't identify them. So this is where I was first introduced to facilitated communication, and I was amazed at the proficiency and elegance that many of the poets were able to communicate via their device. Each of them had a preferred device, some electronic, some not. This form of communicating often requires the support of a facilitator, which means that while representing the preferred and frequently only method of communication for people with severe autism, it is subject to significant criticism by some scholars. Therefore, ethical and practical considerations concerning authenticity, capacity, and consent required careful attention when designing the research. These factors, however, needed to be held within a methodological design that provided space for the inclusion, respect, and empowerment of research participants to ensure their voices were authentically represented. As previously mentioned, the inability to speak has led to a widely accepted assumption that people with level 3 autism are severely cognitively impaired. Some recent findings, however, including my own, are debunking this belief. I'm sure this is not promoted in this environment either. It was identified in my study and confirmed by the nonverbal narrative literature that communication differences do not result from the inability for expression by someone with autism, but rather in the inability of others to recognise and translate certain behaviours. This misunderstanding has grave implications for non or minimally speaking autistic people regarding their ability to access strategies for meaningful conversation or communication. In the interest of time, I will not go into the debate about facilitated communication, which was a huge part of the ethical considerations of my thesis, except to say that sensory movement differences in autistic people necessitates certain assistance for dexterity and accuracy, which is why a facilitator is a necessary component to the process. It is vital then that a controversy about their chosen style of communication does not actively serve to further silence an already marginalised group. I wonder if future research will identify that neurological differences seen in non-speaking autistic people may require the support of an engaged facilitator for successful communication, which arguably is a necessary component of any form of communication, verbal or otherwise. Designing methods of data collection from a group of people who do not communicate by speech by a researcher who is not part of this demographic required a creative approach. The recruitment process for the study provided opportunity to interact with potential participants and also assess their capacity for involvement. 6 of the 7 participants were published poets or authors who were members of the Brotherhood of the Wordless, which confirmed their intellectual capacity. Following the information provided in the recruitment process, consent was enthusiastically provided by all participants via their communication device. The research was approved by the formal ethics processes at Griffith University. Communication is one of the fundamental elements of humanness. Conducting research with people with barriers to communication presented specific ethical considerations concerning agency and inclusion. Designing a methodology that considered responsible ethical practice alongside respectful participant involvement in the research process was paramount. It was considered vital that the voice of the participant be authentically represented. Therefore, provision of a space for their narratives to be heard became a key consideration. As such, working with participants' chosen communication style was vital to the success of the project. Within a qualitative study, a bricolage approach permitted the flexibility for the necessary adaptations specific to such a complicated research process. An interweaving of interpretive and narrative approaches into the structure resulted in the ability for the researcher, me, to come alongside participants as they told their stories in a mutually interactive dialogue. These stories then became the raw data for the study and allowed me to become immersed into the lived experiences of participants. It was a rich and mutually engaging encounter. Almost all first-hand research with people with autism has focused on individuals who have expressive language and the ability to communicate independently. Therefore, interviewing people with communication impairments was a relatively recent innovation with scant information available to support considerations for non or minimally speaking autistic people as direct participants. As I was sailing into uncharted territory, interviews were approached in a type of trial and error style. Concern for the process was unfounded, however, as interviews proved a very successful method of data collection. And you can see some pictures here of people using their boards. These are not my participants. These are photographs that I've got permission to use out of external people. The methodological considerations were complex and many, and in the interests of time, I've chosen not to delve too deeply into these today. Even so, there were many surprising and exciting discoveries along the way. Social communication challenges typical to the autistic experience could result in an incorrect assumption that this group of participants would be difficult to engage. It transpired, however, that whilst they were highly animated, often getting up during the interview to walk around the room, fiddling with personal items such as pieces of cord or fidget sticks, and rarely making eye contact, they were engaged in the process from the beginning of the interview. They also demonstrated understanding of the interview process. The information provided was always relevant to the question and presented in full sentences typical of conversational speech. Careful attention was required to work with certain idiosyncrasies typical to this population, rather than interpreting them as congruent with similar behaviours should they be noted amongst neurotypical people. For example, facial expressions often did not match the words being typed in a typical way. The ethical responsibilities to identify and monitor any distress meant that careful attention was given to these nuances. When incongruencies did occur between a participant's words and behaviours, I was intentional about inquiring as to their correct meaning. The ability of a bricolage methodology to explore unique and expansive approaches to research provided scope for such accommodations. These adaptations also demonstrate the importance of researcher education and understanding pertaining to specific research populations, along with the ability for flexible and creative adaptations to the research process. Given the ongoing controversies concerning facilitated communication, issues of authenticity and reliability required careful consideration to ensure diligence both in the design and implementation phases of the study. Strategies pertaining to this included the research assistant reading aloud the responses after each interview question to confirm accuracy in transcription, and the fact that the participants did not use the same facilitator. 7 interviewees used 6 different facilitators in 6 different locations. However, strong, consistent themes emerged from the collective data, along with similar stories, attitudes, and life experiences, demonstrating that the data was not manufactured by a facilitator. Furthermore, in the data collected from the 2 participants who used the same facilitator, linguistically, each participant's choice of words was markedly different from that of their facilitator, with whom I chatted prior to and after the interviews. The experiences of the participants were personally unique to each one. One of these participants carried out the interview in the presence of his mother, who validated parts of the story unknown to the facilitator. He was also chided by his mum for typing a word that he wasn't allowed to say, and she wouldn't let him say it. I missed the word, and she was like, you know, you're not allowed to say that word. And so there was some very colourful language. They really told their stories from the heart with some colourful language, and this boy's mum wouldn't let him say some of the words he wanted to say. So that just was, again, just proof of the authenticity of the process. So data was analysed manually and then electronically with the use of NVivo software. Every participant expressed gratitude and excitement at being asked to be involved in this research and at having the opportunity to look more deeply into their life experience with someone who was interested in their world. More so, however, participants expressed deep appreciation for the opportunity to find it. The major themes that were identified was, of course, spirituality, and participants discussed many ways in which their lives were impacted by spiritual experiences, attitudes to spirituality, apparent divine or celestial encounters. They were mind-blowing, and or deeper than usual sensitivity to other people, animals, the environment, and the universe. Of previous exposure to formal religion, individual descriptions of belief, views, and types of spiritual experiences were remarkably similar. Each participant observed that spirituality was difficult to describe or understand, however, also regarded their spirituality as important, personal, and directly connected to their well-being. One participant said, "My spirituality lets others experience my humanity." Whether or not a participant believed in a divine being per se, each expressed an understanding and acceptance of their spirituality and how their inner experience connected them to other people, to nature, to the universe as a whole, and if they so believed, to a higher power. Participants described their spirituality as encompassing an experiential, unifying element that involved both physical and emotional processes and incorporated the environment and humanity, rather than a static or formal practice such as attendance at a church or temple. It appeared that the participants of this study had the progressive aspects of themselves commonly associated as pertaining to one's soul, such as intellectual, moral, visionary, and emotional elements. However, even though this was a dominant theme in the data, no participant reported any process that educated or informed them of their spirituality. It's a part of their experience. The data suggested that regardless of formal religious beliefs or backgrounds, people with severe autism attribute great importance to their spirituality. Some participants said that they had always known God and enjoyed communicating with God without words. So there's a whole other research study there. This was also reflected in the non-verbal narrative literature. Aside from the rich data provided by participants in regards to spirituality, there were a number of other interesting observations about their world. These are vitally important to the deeper understanding of their lived experience. All participants, in one way or another, echoed an aspiration to be recognised and accepted for who they are and to be provided with the necessary supports to contribute to society. Level of intelligence that in some cases was astounding and relayed the frustration of their world before being able to access a communication device. An interesting observation concerning the expressive style of language used by the participants was also noted. The data demonstrated a rich use of metaphor for language expression that was shared by all participants, particularly in regards to their spirituality. Participant 7 conceptualized spirituality as indescribable by language, reporting, "I most always never use conventional language in spirituality. My spirit flows through my dance and feelings and music. The words are just the door we need to open and enter." In terms of the use of facilitated communication, naturally, the idiosyncratic ways of communication necessary for those who do not use verbal language provided an interesting backdrop to deep context. Participants described in explicit detail the difference in their lives once they were introduced to a method of communication that afforded them the ability to express their thoughts. From the non-verbal literature, Peyton Goddard describes the process as follows. "The journey of life cannot be travelled without a clear mode of successful communication and listeners who caringly support. Of utmost importance is the assurance that a system of communication supplies me, and for that I answer, thank God. First, without a voice, never are people safe. Second, without the ability to communicate, a voiceless person is easily and unbearably frustrated by the behaviours they must resort to and often incorrect interpretation of these behaviours. With facilitated communication, I finally gained a mode of dependable communication which allowed me to tell the truth of my life and begin to relieve the fear which plagued me. Contrary to contemporary understanding about people with nonverbal autism, the desire for and ability to maintain strong personal relationships was also a dominant theme, both on an individual and collective level. Participants reported a deep connection to their fellow autistics, their family and friends, and an extraordinary sensitivity to the earth. This theme is also dominant in the nonverbal narrative literature. A surprising theme that rebounded throughout the interviews was the profound conviction that each participant held concerning their own life purpose. Separately, each expressed an understanding that their disability was for a reason and that they wanted to make a meaningful contribution to society. Some expressed the desire to be a disability advocate, and others wanted the world to know that people with autism are intelligent and loving. Some expressed the desire to let the world know about God's message of love. One participant felt he had a message in helping people understand the importance of protecting the environment, expressing an ability to feel the pain of trees and animals when subject to human understanding. Or misunderstanding, I apologise. When I asked one participant how she maintains a forgiving attitude when people misunderstand her, her response was profound. She said that by living in a world of silence, she has opportunity to spend a lot of time in her own thoughts. In this way, she was able to choose how she responds to people's ignorance about autism, and she chooses to be loving rather than angry. Many participants also expressed a desire for the world to know that they can communicate and that they have something to say. William Stillman said that people with nonverbal autism can be carriers of great wisdom. This research confirms this and has revealed much more about this group than is able to be presented in a 45-minute time slot. Communication issues have resulted in a paucity of relevant information, which leaves much of their life experiences unknown, and has also resulted in severe misunderstandings concerning their gifts and abilities. This research is challenging this notion and represents the tip of the iceberg in helping to understand the lived experience of non or minimally speaking autistic people. There is much to build on in future research. Conducting research with people with barriers to communication presents specific ethical considerations concerning agency and inclusion. Designing a methodology that considers responsible ethical practice alongside respectful participant involvement in the research process is paramount. Furthermore, such research must ensure that the voice of the participant is authentically represented. As such, working with participants' chosen communication style is vital to the success of the project. One participant from this study described his life as follows. I am a genius trapped in an evil body that lets me down and torments me constantly. I get so upset and crazy and demented, and it's not who I am. I am a worthy citizen of the world, not just a pile of poo who is a disgrace to anything. You can imagine how he's been treated throughout his life. I'll go back to the quote. I am a genius. Listen to me. Don't ignore me. Don't look at me with horror or disgust. Give me a life worth living and I will amaze and delight you. So what is next? It's no secret that communication is one of the fundamental elements of humanness. People often ask me how to include people with severe autism into their faith communities. It's a great question, yet the answer is so simple. It's just like you would include anybody else. What anyone who attends a faith community is seeking is inclusion and connectedness with a like-minded community. Still, people who experience life differently are often shunted to the side where they struggle to find a meaningful place. This research has reinforced to me the great value of each human story. I came to understand that if someone is trying to communicate with me and I am not understanding them, then the issue is with me, not them. In other words, if I am willing to embrace, I broaden not only my experience, but that of my friend. Before this research started, I was profoundly impacted by a young man who I met on a disability camp. Andrew represented my first encounter with someone with nonverbal autism. Over a weekend, I saw this young man transform. By gently trusting that he could understand me and taking time to sit with him and simply allow myself to be present to him, by the end of the weekend, we were laughing and dancing together, totally communicating with our eyebrows. I learned something that changed my life. I think somehow I learned from a traumatized teenager the language of God. Perhaps God's communication style is beyond words. Perhaps people with autism have a unique insight into the language of love. In conclusion, I'm sure you're all dying to know what's going on with my children. Well, never being one to let with his dreams, soon after I embarked on my academic journey in 2013, Sam decided he would also like to study at university. To make a very long story short, I designed and implemented a pilot program at the institution I worked at then in Australia, where a team of supporters explored the possibility of providing specific supports to assist an atypical student to reach academic success. By taking one subject per semester and with the support of an academic tutor, Sam graduated in 2017 with a degree in social science. And do I look excited there? Proudest Mother Day ever. My youngest son, Mitchell, is more the sporty type, and he is an elite 10-pin bowler and has represented his home state, Queensland, in the Australian All-Ability Futsal competition, helping his team win the national title for that year. He has also represented Australia in the International All-Ability Futsal competition. Last year, Mitchell became engaged to the beautiful Rebecca, and we are now exploring how they negotiate their unique disabilities as a couple. What has come together through me through all this is that God knew and named Sam before he was born. God knew who he was. He knew he would live in this world with a disability. This tells me the enormous worth that God places on people with a disability who are created with that imprint of the Imago Dei, just like anyone else. Unfortunately, that exploration, which was also a part of my thesis, is a whole other presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing those stories and wonderful stories, personal stories, but also the research that you did. It's absolutely fascinating. I've written down loads of questions, but I'm sure that our listeners have questions as well. So what we will do now is we will have a 2 to 3 minute break to process what Karen has said and process some of the questions you might want to ask. And so the Q&A is open. You can ask your question there. And bear in mind that this is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube in due course. And so if you want to remain anonymous, there's a tick box. When you ask your question, you can tick the box and then you can ask the question as an anonymous person. I will moderate the discussion. I will try, even if you do mention your name, not to mention it just for the purposes of the recording. So let's have a 2 to 3 minute break, and then we'll come back with the Q&A. With ours beyond words. So best assumption would be that those without language can still have a spiritual experience. You made brief reference to this. I would be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you for that question. That's a very interesting question. And I will just start by saying I'm not an expert on, so there is a distinct difference between language and speech, and not having speech does not equate to not having language. But you're right, all the participants I worked with had language, but no speech. For people without language, I'm not sure. I can't say that I'm an expert on that, but as part of my research, I explored the language of God. And it turned out that wasn't words. So when we explored that, it seemed that the language of God is love, actually, and communicated through relationship and love. And so regardless of language or regardless of speech, I think God meets each, the Imago Dei is the part of God that's in every human, and where God meets that human in their own way of communicating. And so, yes, I would definitely say no matter how profoundly disabled somebody is, I think that disability is not part of the Imago Dei, it's something else. That was part of the research, but there was just so much I couldn't put it all into the presentation today. Does that answer the question?
I don't know whether that answered the question, but it was definitely an answer. So I'm going to continue with a second question from the same person. Okay. So they are saying, I have come across some empirical evidence, indicative, not conclusive, that autistic people don't use relational brain processes to express their spirituality. This evidence was interpreted variously as either autistic people are less religious or autistic people express their spirituality differently. Some of your comments suggested sympathy with the latter. What are your thoughts on this?
Does anybody express their spirituality exactly the same as the next person? And so spirituality is a very experiential thing. I think people with autism, like I said right at the beginning, we group people together and we say people with autism all do this, but they still have their own individual, unique way of expressing their life and themselves. And so I think there will be individual differences. I do think they're less likely to be confined by religious expectations, just like they are less likely to be confined by social expectations than neurotypical people. But I still think they still have their own expression of spirituality, and I firmly believe that we have a lot to learn from them about God and spirituality, that perhaps because we are so learned in traditional ways, we it's not as easy for neurotypical people to see the differences that God might want to express himself through other people with. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. So that's great. Thank you so much for those responses to sophisticated questions. We're moving on to someone else with a question, and they're saying, thank you for this research, absolutely brilliant. Do you know of any changes happening in the institution of church to construct theology on what I call the no words theology? Felt sense of locus and bottom-up processing, a lived experience of neurodivergent individuals. I think that's multiple questions almost in one. But do you change any changes? Do you sense any changes happening in the institution that we call church?
Not in Australia, I don't. We seem to be far more. I do see quite a bit of work through the Institute of Theology and Disability, and so I think there's pockets of really good things happening, but I can't tell you where off the top of my head, and I'm not aware of any none that I'm involved in anyway. There was at the Institute this year, there was representatives there from a church that had a component of their church called Joyful Noise, and it was where people with all with disabilities could come with whatever their expression was and worship together in community in whatever way they wanted. you didn't have to have a disability to go, but if you did, you were very welcome. And so there are little pockets of things happening, but no, I haven't seen anything particularly about wordless worship, which I think was what you asked.
Yes, and if we then consider the same question for the field of theology, more the academic theology, do you sense any movement towards a recognition of the lack of language, or not lack of language, I'm saying that wrongly. Do you sense any kind of attention to theology without words, as it were?
Traditionally, spirituality without words was very much the journey of the mystics. And I did actually compare, part of my research, I compared the journey of somebody with non-speaking autism with a mystic. Would there be any difference if the mystic used silence and solitude to enhance spiritual awareness and heighten spirituality? Would there be any difference with just living that as a life context, because that's the life context? Would that be conducive to heightened spirituality in the autistic? And it just seemed, with the participants of my study, it just seemed only 2 of them had any religious background, but yet they'd all had profound spiritual experiences. So, and particularly at times when they were in great distress, or where they needed some support and they weren't able to get support from another human because they couldn't communicate what they needed, which was quite remarkable.
Thank you for that. Moving on then to another question, again back to the church context. Here is someone saying, thank you for your research and experience sharing. As a church pastor, I would like to understand more. Can church fellowship help non or minimally speaking autistic individuals develop a better spiritual experience? Or how can it assist in fostering their spiritual experiences and expressions within the church?
Thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. I wonder if the answer to that is, can the non-speaking autistic person help the church? Other church members find a deeper spirituality, because you might find that they have that deeper spirituality as part of their life experience, but how they can express that to other people in a way that other people understand may be the issue. And so I guess the first thing would be to figure out a communication process with that person and ask them, what do they need? What do they want? What can they do for them? I'm sure, but I don't know if you're thinking of anyone specific, but all of the participants of my study had stories that they were busting to tell, but no one had ever asked them. They'd never. In fact, one of my participants, she had a long-term carer that came with her and facilitated for her, and the carer said to her, I didn't know that. And she said, you never asked. And so there was, so I think that the key is, just with any other person, if you want to enhance their spiritual experience, you have to get down and find out what they need and find out what they want to do. So you have to, the first step is to find out how to communicate with them, and then be willing to take the time, because it's slow. It's not like normal conversation. It's very slow, but so rich.
That's great, and I like the way you turn around that question. That we first of all, let's learn as a church, but then also, of course, as a church, I think as a pastor, you're keen to serve all your church members, and I think that question came from that angle. But this is great. Another question here is someone he missed the beginning of the paper because of a power cut. so apologies if this is already addressed, and I think you addressed some of it, but it's still worth asking this question, I think. There has been a lot of anxiety expressed by autistic people about terms like severe and also about the term nonverbal. Has this been an issue you have consciously struggled with? It can be hard to find appropriate language to specify the relevant phenomena. Or would you think about using different language as you continue to develop this research?
Totally. So as I mentioned I did mention at the beginning, I put a bit of a disclaimer out at the beginning, because when I started the research, this was the terminology this was all the terminology that there was, and this is how I published all my thesis was published in journal articles using this language. So as I've moved on, and then I finished in 2019, and then we had 4 years of COVID. So it's you know, how it's all progressed. It has changed worldwide, and I do, and it's hard sometimes to know how to say what I am trying to say in a different way. So I mean no disrespect.
Sure, and I didn't sense that at all. But it's great, and I think in the field of autism broadly, but certainly also autism theology, we need to grapple with these issues. So I'm grateful for the question, but also for your answer. That's great. Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to take the opportunity as moderator of the discussion to ask a question myself, and that is, I'm really curious why there has been so little research into the spiritual experiences of non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic people. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned two reasons for that. One is certain theories like the absent self theory. So why bother if, and then the assumption should be probably that spirituality is relational. If there's an absent self theory and autistic people are set not to be relational, then why bother doing the research? Another reason you mentioned, I think, is, well, communicating with someone who doesn't speak is difficult for those who are not used to do that, right? So not better or worse at all, but that's just a difference in communication styles, and the majority of people haven't adapted to that. Are those the only two reasons that you think is explain the lack of research in this field, or are there other reasons?
I think it's a bigger thing, Leon. I think the reason why there's no research on spirituality is because there's barely any research on anything with people with minimally or non-speaking autism. There's barely, and that's because there's secondhand research. So they'll do research and they'll ask the parents or the carers or the teachers, but very, very, very little first-hand research because they're considered difficult to communicate with. I also think the controversy about facilitated or augmented communication has created a barrier, but I think that barrier is breaking down now. Particularly, well, in Australia, Rosemary Crossley came from Australia, and so we're that's one place where we are a bit of ahead in Australia, and so FC is more widely accepted here, I think, than it is in other places. But I think that barrier to facilitated communication has also been something that's difficult. I think you're right. I think there's the current worldview is that people with disabilities need to be ministered to and can't really have their own experience. I think that's a kind of a bit of a worldview that carries through. But I wish there was more study because it's really, there's so much more to know.
That's absolutely true. And it's an exciting field of research. So I really hope that many more people will kind of follow your lead and do research in this area.
Too.
Yeah. But meanwhile, questions keep coming in. Here is a question from someone and they are saying this was such a beautiful. Karen, thank you, Karen. My church is currently exploring different expressions of doing church. I sense God is calling us to take church outdoors, to worship God in His creation. This would help us with a lot of the sensory challenges within our busy church. I would appreciate your thoughts about this, and have you come across this model of church before? And can I just add to that? Can you specify that, make that specific to autistic people, and especially the group of people that you worked with?
Well, the group that I worked with was not a Christian group, so.
I mean, not non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic people generally.
Yeah. I think that's a fabulous idea, because I know all of the participants that I worked with drew a sense of spirituality from nature. One, as I said in the presentation, reported being able to feel the pain of trees and animals. Whales, he felt the pain of whales. That was quite impactful for him. And so I think being outdoors would be naturally less confining than being in a building for people. But no, I don't know of it happening anywhere particularly.
Staying with the topic of how we do church, as it were, here's a question from someone, and they're saying, it was said of Jesus that he went in and out among the people. As you suggest, both life in community and quiet time or quiet time in solitude are part of the Christian tradition. Do you have any thoughts about how churches might rebalance a little from what seems to be a leaning towards the communal? Everything happens in church, in meetings or social events. How can we rebalance that community aspect and the solitude aspect that we both find in the Christian tradition?
That's a great question. That's a really interesting question. I think in any faith community that I've been involved in, there's some members of the community that appreciate solitude, contemporary, that appreciate hymns and the more traditional ways of worship, and then there's other members of the community that like more upbeat music and more theatrical type presentations. And so I think the way that we could do that would be to introduce it for the people that were interested in exploring some silence and mystical type traditional ways of worship and prayer, different types of prayer and those kind of things, and for those people that were interested, and then just see how the community, how it expanded and what would happen. That would be a way to introduce it, I think, for those people, just as an alternative for people that wanted to pursue that part of worship or that style of worship.
Yeah, that's great. Right, Karen, I was thinking when you were starting with this presentation and the spiritual experience that you had, and also the many participants or many others that you were talking about, and I can imagine that we will have some listeners either today or later on YouTube, and they might be quite skeptical about those kind of experiences, and even I think amongst theologians there might be some skepticism towards certain types of experiences or stories. How would you respond to that kind of skepticism?
Some people are skeptical about spiritual experiences, although to me the whole of theology is built on people's experiences. You know, the Apostle Paul was struck blind, and without that experience of being struck blind, he had this encounter with Jesus, and you know, there's so many things that we talk about in the Bible, burning bushes and talking donkeys and things. So mine was nothing like that. It was just something that I felt that I was told, that transpired. It was tested in the reality of it coming true, because no one thought that Sam would live. In terms of other people, I would never discredit anyone's spiritual experience, because it's personal to the person. How can I say that something didn't happen? So there's a lot of things that are unexplained in life. So one thing I do know is, if you don't believe in miracles, you probably won't experience one. So if you believe in these things, then it's more likely that you'll recognise. That's
Yeah, thank you for that. We've got time for 2 short questions and 2 short answers before we wrap up. So here is a question. I'm curious, in your research, I'm curious about how individuals establish their faith and spiritual experiences. It appears that, as you mentioned, they have their own unique experiences, yet we often overlook their spiritual journey. And by we, I assume that is a non-autistic person, or not someone who's yeah, or at least not it's a speaker. So we overlook their spiritual journey. As a parent, I recognize that we may not be diligent in nurturing these experiences. Could you elaborate on your experiences and share insights on how you address this aspect, the nurturing of these experiences?
I think it would be the same as nurturing any child's experience. You said as a parent, it's listening to the child. When my children were little, they came to me with experiences that were way out of my realm of what I thought possible. Actually, they taught me about things. Sammy, when he was a little boy, he was getting teased at school, and he said an angel came and told him that God had a plan for him and it was going to be a good one and not to worry. Just amazing things that I didn't know what to do with when they were little. We're in a quite traditional church, and those things weren't talked about. So we just, but those experiences from the boys, I just encouraged them to talk to God and to tell me about them, and we talked about them, and what did it mean for you, and what did you learn from that? And Sammy said he learned that the other kids at school were dumb and he wasn't, because that's what he learned from it. But and so then we talk about that, and we just explored things. But what it did do was open my mind to new possibilities, that the way I conceptualize religious teaching and spirituality might not be all there is, that there might be something bigger than what I knew, and that they were the teachers, I wasn't the teacher. I was certainly the student in a lot of those things.
Yeah, that's great. There's time for a 30-second answer to the last question, Karenne, and that question is, could you share a bit more about the research you are doing currently and hope to do in the future? And what do you see as priorities for further research in this area? 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay, so what I want to do next is, so my thesis is published in journal articles, 6 journal articles came out of the thesis. What I want to now do is turn it into a book, but not your traditional thesis book that only gets read by half a dozen of your own students, but I want to turn it into a more readable book about spirituality and parenting. And I think with the growing numbers of autism, there's a lot of parents out there really lost in the process, and so make it something that can bring out the positives and really highlight the gifts of autism and disability, and particularly as my journey as a mum, when they were little, I just thought it was so hard, but now I look at them and they've come so far. It's, you know, it's a good story. It's a good story when you get your head around it and see God's journey and God's plan in it. And so that's the next step. And then there's lots and lots of research. I would really love to research further that image of God and what that means in terms of people with disability holding the same image of God as everybody. We all hold the same image of God. So what exactly is it, that image? What exactly is that image? That's what I'd like to know.
Lots of things to research, but today you've introduced us to your research on non and minimally speaking autistic people and their spirituality. Karenne, this has been fascinating. This has been a fascinating webinar, fascinating Q&A. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate that. And as you said, there is so much more to research. I also want to thank everyone who attended this webinar and everyone who will listen to it or watch it later on YouTube. Thank you so much for your interest in this work, in this area. If you're interested in connecting with the Center for Autism and Theology, don't hesitate to drop us an email. The email address is on the slide that will pop up in a moment. And then it only remains me to thank two people in particular who have been working in the background. You haven't seen that, but that is Zoe Strong and Harry Gibbons, both related to the center as well, and they have made this webinar possible. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and wishing you a wonderful day. Thanks.